Inside a wartime plant, one Jeep rolled off the line every 2 minutes. Before dawn, the building was a low, breathing machine. The lights hummed like distant cities. Through the windows, fog smudged the sky. Inside, metal shone like a second sun. Presses exhaled clouds of steam and oil vapor. Sparks sizzled and fell in orange rain. A conveyor crawled through the cavernous hall, a black spine along which frames and axles and engines were assembled into something that looked, at first glance, almost ordinary, until the rhythm resolved and the ordinary became extraordinary. On the shop floor, the noise was organized chaos. Pneumatic hammers beat in syncopation with welding torches. The smell of coolant and hot metal sat against the sharp sweetness of paint thinner. Workers moved like players in an enormous score. Some steady and practiced, others new and still learning their measures. Every station had a micro-ritual. A riveter kept a ceramic coffee cup at his elbow, the glaze crazed from years of heat. A woman on the final fit line smoothed the letter pinned to the steel of a bulkhead. "Bring him home," the note said, before tightening the last bolt. A foreman tapped his clipboard in a way that was more habit than information, a staccato punctuation that signaled readiness to the men and women at his side. The heartbeat motif was literal and faint. The press room's main flywheel thudded under everything else, a mechanical pulse that began slow in the early hours and picked up as the day progressed. For engineers and line workers alike, that pulse became a clock. They timed breaks to it, bends of metal to it, even prayers to it. When the rhythm steadied, it meant flow. When it stumbled, it meant trouble. Somewhere, far from the plant's steam and oil and lamps, soldiers were waiting. Somewhere else, a convoy would press forward on dirt roads and frozen river crossings because a vehicle had been formed minutes earlier on this same floor. The challenge shoved at the building like weather. Orders had arrived in stacks, more than anyone had expected, demanding speed without catastrophe. A military request had turned into a logistical imperative, and the plant was the thin seam where policy became metal. There were whispered numbers, production goals that read like instructions on a stopwatch. 1 every 2 minutes, management began to say in private meetings, not as boast, but as a target that would force trade-offs into decisions every hour and every minute. The line could be tuned to that cadence, or it would stall under the weight of its own imperfections. If this story is drawing you in, subscribe and stay for the full behind-the-scenes look at how impossibly high demand was met, not by machines alone, but by people who learned to listen to metal. The first failures were small enough to be explained away, and large enough to be warning. A stamping die, overloaded by a sequence of thicker-than-specified sheet runs, cracked at the radius where force concentrated. A batch of leaf springs, baked too long in a single furnace rack because a shift scheduler doubled crews inadvertently, came out brittle and snapped under a test load. A jig meant to hold a frame in a perfect geometry, warped when a new torque wrench introduced an angle the fixture hadn't anticipated. Each setback had its own sound, the ring of flattened metal, the sickening thud of a dropped assembly, the sharp curse silenced by a supervisor's glance. At the center of the crisis was a handful of people whose lives and reputations became entangled with the machine's fate. The chief engineer, tall, with grease still hinted under his fingernails despite his office, kept sleepless vigil over drawings and prototype runs. Arthur Bellamy had the kind of patience that could map tolerances 3 layers deep, and yet, when the press failed, he would stand on the shop floor for long minutes, feeling the volume of sound and trying to hear the mistake in it. He had an engineer's eye for excess, a burr that caught a rivet, a misaligned pinhole that would, if not corrected, cause a car to wobble at high speed. He also had the political skill to coax mechanics and cutters and material buyers into shared solutions. "You don't win with a single bolt," he would tell his team. "You win by keeping the orchestra together." On the line, Miguel Santos, 22, taught the basics of machining by his father and hardened by necessity, kept the rollers true. Miguel's hands were quick and scarred where press operators sometimes bled. He had answered the call to the plant after an accident on a distant front took his brother's life. He soldered fractured components with the particular care of someone who had learned fragility from loss. Miguel carried a photograph inside his jacket, his brother in uniform, a smiling face, a letter still folded to the size of a coin. In quiet moments, when the burners cooled and parts were staged for assembly, Miguel read that letter and then checked the bolts as if the soldier might be riding in the Jeep that day. On the final assembly line, a row of women worked at a steady beat. Miriam Cole supervised their station with an eye that missed nothing. Known as one of the Rosie group, though none of them liked to be named by the stereotype, Miriam had worked her way from riveting to inspection, and her hands had the practiced memory of hundreds of torsion springs. She carried a small blade in her apron pocket, used to shave away paint fleck before a seam was welded. She had a laugh that came out quick and warm, but when inspectors walked the line, she tightened, a guardian of standards. The women on her bench took pride in finishing touches. The exact torque sign on a wheel lug, the correct routing of a fuel line that would keep a trip from turning into disaster. "We make the last human check," Miriam liked to say. "If it leaves here good, maybe someone eats that night." Problems multiplied where speed and complexity met. Supply chains frayed under wartime pressure. Sheets of steel arrived with inconsistent temper because rolling mills prioritized different contracts and blamed each other for deviations. Bolts meant for one batch washed up with the wrong head stamp. A shipment by rail was delayed, leaving unfinished frames idling and rusting at the side of the plant. Military inspectors pressed for faster output. Labor leaders demanded safety. Every solution to one problem seemed to introduce tension elsewhere. Failures had other consequences beyond the line. One afternoon, a test vehicle, newly assembled, was sent to the proving grounds for a full load run. The vehicle, bound for a commander's unit, had passed static inspection. But in continuous high-speed testing, a rear axle developed a progressive crack and fractured. There was no spectacular explosion, only the terrifying slow yaw of a vehicle that had lost support where it was needed most. The test driver walked away shaken. The chief engineer's calm broke into sharp, clipped orders. Bring back every axle of the same lot. Shut down the heat treat ovens. Isolate the batch. Men who had felt confident in the metallurgy of their work suddenly doubted the very furnaces that had been trusted for years. That night, a handful of technicians and metallurgists stayed until dawn. The plant's lab was a small room with bright lights and a table cluttered with spindles and charts. The metallurgist, a quiet woman who read microstructures like a language, fitted thin sections of metal under a microscope and traced the lines of carbon and grain boundaries. It polymerized differently because of the rack, she said, meaning the way parts were stacked in the furnace had created zones of under- and over-baked material. They ran a manual temper cycle, some borrowed measurement tools from a nearby plant operated by Indofino, and compared results. The discovery was simple and devastating. Small deviations in heat exposure could mean the difference between a spring that flexed and one that fractured. The solution required more than a tweak. It demanded process change on a scale that cut into production time. New racks for furnaces to ensure even spacing, revised timers for soak periods, and a reallocation of ovens so that batches of similar geometry would be processed together. Each change meant downtime, time the military watched with impatience. But the alternative was worse. A single failure on the battlefield could cost lives. The plant had to choose between the cadence managers dreamed of and the precise, sometimes sluggish rhythm that metallurgy required. Choices like that turned ordinary people into custodians of consequence. Miguel, who polished axles at the bench, began to think of a Jeep as multiple improbable alliances. Steel that had flowed true, bolts whose threads met the nuts in exact contact, bearings with a whisper of oil, and a frame whose geometry matched the suspension jigs. He took to testing parts by ear, a skill taught by older machinists. When he spun a wheel in his hands and heard a subtle grumble, he could tell if the bearing was slightly misaligned. His ear, more than any gauge, had saved a batch from an invisible defect. Arthur Bellamy's notebook filled with small corrections and sketches. A shim added to a fixture here, a stop collar modified there. He began to look for the systemic cause rather than patching each symptom. If you treat symptoms, he told his junior engineers, you'll be a busy clinic. If you treat the disease, you cure 1,000 patients. That meant looking beyond the obvious, inspecting the way supply trucks were unloaded, the temperature gradients across the paint booth, the slack in a conveyor motor that allowed frames to droop fractionally at the same point every 25 frames. In the realm between failure and solution, there was invention, and invention was often an unglamorous kind of luck spliced with stubbornness. A machine operator named Jonas improvised a guide rail from a length of scrap and a set of clamps, turning what had been a recurring misalignment into a consistent seam. A welder, new to the plant and trained in shipyards, suggested a tack welder sequence that reduced heat distortion during final joining. The seamstress for canvas tops adapted a pattern from a civilian carrier to ensure rain would not collect in front of a windshield. These were small acts, hardly recorded in reports, but together they nudged the plant toward stability. Not all fixes were purely mechanical. There were soft changes to the culture that mattered. Supervisors who once punished pace errors with stern lectures learned to stop and listen when someone raised a concern. The plant organized shift handoff meetings that lasted only 5 minutes, but created an account of problems that made troubleshooting cumulative instead of episodic. An electrician began logging transient voltage drops on a clipboard, so simple that management at first scoffed. But the log pointed to a faulty transformer that, when repaired, removed a cascade of intermittent malfunctions from several stations. Risk lived in the margins. On a rainy night when the plant was running 2 shifts back-to-back and the central air system was overloaded, a paint booth operator inhaled a sharp breath of solvent and fainted. The line halted. The women at Miriam's station, herself with a daughter at home and a father on the front, took over inspection while the operator recovered, and their care saved a full car from being painted with a faulty primer coat that would have flaked in weeks. It was the sort of near miss that did not make the headlines, but defined the moral texture of the place. Small human attentions that kept a production line from becoming a list of regrets. Pressure came from outside. Military inspectors visited with clipboards and impartial faces, their reports both a sword and a map. Representatives from logistics threatened to reroute orders if the plant couldn't meet schedules. Union leaders pushed for safer practices and hazard pay. And within that squeeze, the plant had to invent certainty, mechanical, procedural, and moral, out of insufficient data. There were political negotiations about overtime, debates over whether to press on despite wear, arguments over whether a fix that cost hours on the line would bring greater reliability in the field. Everyone recognized the stakes. A canceled convoy could mean a strategic hole. A defective Jeep on a mission could mean a soldier left stranded. In one particularly acute sequence, a set of rear axle housings showed microscopic porosity, tiny voids caught in the die casting that would propagate into critical fractures under torsional load. The die shop produced thousands of housings, and the porosity had been inconsistent. The plant's die setter, an old man whose hands looked like rolled newspaper, blamed the chillers that controlled die temperature. Material suppliers blamed a change in ingot recipe because steelmakers had rearranged their smelting priorities under government direction. The production line slowed to an uneasy crawl as samples were pulled and tested. When supply lines are fraying, ingenuity often crosses departmental boundaries. The dice setter proposed running a pre-cool cycle and then a rapid quench for housings destined for rugged terrain, an approach that increased the hardness slightly and closed potential voids at the surface. That quench increased the risk of thermal cracking, however, so a tempering phase had to be added immediately afterward. The solution, while effective, required coordination, a new heat treatment schedule, more labor to move housings through ovens, and spare parts to keep the modified process from introducing its own failures. The line yielded inches in tempo for greater miles in reliability. There was a moral conversation inside the plant that mostly took place in small pockets, in corners of lunchrooms, at the edges of locker rooms, over cigarettes outside a service door. The people who stamped and bolted and welded were proud of their craft and anguished about its purpose. "We make these things," Miriam told a younger coworker, tracing a rivet with a fingertip, "and they go to people who have to do terrible things sometimes." Her voice was not moralizing, but weary with complexity. They wanted to do their job well, so that when a jeep carried a medic to wounded men, it didn't fail. But they also grappled with the weight of being suppliers to a war machine. The plant's leadership tried to balance this unease with reminders of the stakes. Posters, stern, bureaucratic, lined the office halls. Quality first, safety always. Bellamy, who had a habit of walking the lines at odd hours, told no one the nights he spent translating failure modes into diagrams and calls for parts. He kept a drawer of letters from field commanders and civilians, sometimes typed, sometimes in flourished ink, thanking the plant for vehicles that had come at critical moments. Those letters were both balm and burden. Each one contained a story of use, sometimes heroic and sometimes tragic. They reminded the crew that their work had consequences beyond the plant gates. As the plant approached a tentative center of competence, the long experiments yielded a soft victory. A process modification that addressed the axle porosity, a jig redesign that maintained frame geometry despite a worn conveyor, and a heat treatment schedule that cooperated with the adjusted die cooling. The breakthrough wasn't a single moment of eureka, but a convergence of small solved mysteries. A test vehicle, assembled to a new checklist born of those fixes, rolled down the proving grounds with an almost surgical smoothness. It endured a prolonged endurance run without any component displaying the earlier modes of failure. The mechanic who had been most skeptical, the one who feared he would be sent to the front instead of a safe factory job, slapped the hood and allowed a laugh that was shockingly young in the face of fatigue. The plant's tempo changed as if on cue. The mechanical heartbeat that had been intermittent steadied into a ruthless metronome. Each substation found a cadence. The press room's timing adjusted so the stamping dies would come home synchronized with the riveters across the hall. The paint booth's feed matched the dryer capacity so flaking became a memory. Workers learned to watch for a particular shiver in the conveyor belt just before misfeeding occurred. When they saw it, they could stop and adjust before welders had to rework. The smell of hot oil became less raw and more like a badge of acquired competence. But stabilized cadence did not yet equal the celebrated target. The plant could build a reliable vehicle. It could not yet guarantee the furious, unbroken pace of one Jeep every 2 minutes for hours on end. The step from dozens per day to that mechanical rhythm demanded orchestration at a different scale. It would require inventory reservoirs that never ran empty, presses that could sustain temper without quench-induced cracking, and, crucially, enough people making the same small judgment calls without fatigue. As the crew prepared to scale up, the questions shifted. Could the quality checks be automated or at least assisted without losing the human eye? Could supply chain bottlenecks be smoothed when rail and ship schedules were in flux? How would they prevent worker exhaustion from eroding the precision they had scrupulously built? And what would happen when the plant's heartbeat accelerated to a metronome that left no space for small pauses? A week of trial runs was scheduled. During that week, the plant ran in what felt like a laboratory. Staggered shifts, additional inspectors, and an experiment in cross-training that allowed one worker to perform two adjacent roles without losing speed. Miguel was assigned to a run where he would check bearings, pack grease, and stage axles at a tempo that pushed his dexterity to a new limit. Miriam's bench would be the final gate, where a modified checklist, simpler in appearance but harder in execution, would decide whether a Jeep was cleared. On the third night of trials, the plant's low mechanical heartbeat became a high, ringing metronome. For 30 minutes, every station hit its marks. Presses timed, welders ran in clean beads, paint dried within specification. Inspectors nodded. A production tally, displayed on a board near the foreman's office, ticked upward as if the plant itself exhaled with relief. Men and women who had been wary found themselves moving with the line, their bodies remembering the choreography and their fingers the torque marks. Still, perfection is a brittle thing. On the fourth hour, a sensor in the seam welder began to misreport arc stability, showing a tiny but persistent oscillation. The technician who monitored the sensor had been awake for almost 20 hours. He rubbed his eyes and thumbed a switch to recalibrate it. The readout stuttered and then steadied. He made a note on the log, recalibrate hourly. Minutes later, Miguel felt the same little shiver in his hands when spinning a bearing and raised his head. A supervisor delayed the line for a quick check. That delay, barely a minute, multiplied across the predicted cadence, but it kept a seam that would have broken under field stress from finding its way into a Jeep destined for combat. At the edge of that night, as the clock tally approached a point of real meaning, the plant caught glimpses of what the rhythm would be like if sustained. Bodies moving with machine precision, an economy of motion where pilots fed engines the fuel they needed and inspectors treated each car as if it were the last chance to get something right. The low-pulse noise of the factory, hammers and motors and belts, organized into a kind of music that was not joyful so much as determined. And yet, beneath the rhythm, moral and logistical shadows lengthened. Warehouse shelves were fuller, but only because shipments had been accelerated from INDEND, a decision that, while improving supply, redirected material from other pressing needs. The military's demand had been met by shifting burdens. In a lunchroom conversation, two women spoke in measured tones. "We are getting faster," one said, "but who's paying for the speed?" They were not asking about money, but about the cost in other places that might now go short. The plant's success could be read as victory and as a redistribution of strain across a wartime economy. When day broke after the test week, the plant's board displayed a simple sentence scribbled in chalk: "Stable runs possible." It was both accomplishment and a call to arms. Arthur Bellamy, who had been awake for 47 hours straight at one point, closed his notebook with a hand that trembled less from exhaustion than from the accumulated weight of responsibility. Miguel tucked his brother's photograph back into his jacket and walked back to his station with fingers that felt more certain than they had days before. Miriam, who had been on the line since breakfast, leaned against a steel column and let the buzz of the plant wash over her like the echo of something that could not be fully owned. But the plant had not yet achieved the mechanical poetry promised by the slogan. It had not yet demonstrated that one Jeep could be rolled off every 2 minutes for the long haul. The proof required not only the machines behaving in concert, but also a supply network that would not wobble, labor agreements that would hold under pressure, and, perhaps most precariously, the social compact that allowed people to give their best without being ground down. The next phase was mapping how to convert these controlled runs into relentless throughput. Engineers drafted sequences for buffer storage that would keep the line fed during brief interruptions.
A foreman suggested a small change to shift patterns that would reduce fatigue by rotating the most demanding stations more frequently, even if that would flinch the raw hour output in the short term. Warehouse teams proposed a color-coded pallet system and tried it overnight. Someone painted stripes on the first trial, and the confusion of the morning shift fell away like fog. Orders arrived in hundreds by radio and courier, some of them vague, some of them precise. The plant would have to make choices: when to trust a new supplier, when to hold a batch for rework, when to push a car through with an acceptable deviation. Between those choices lived the lives of distant soldiers and the faces of the workers who imagined them. Despite the progress, the plant's leadership knew the most dangerous moment often sits right after a breakthrough. Confidence rises, oversight eases, human fatigue increases. There were stories in the plant of other factories elsewhere that had achieved spectacular runs only to find a latent defect emerge after a week and whose reputations crumbled. The engineers insisted on staged escalation, more trials at varying cadences, a redundancy of critical stations, and a rolling audit that could catch creeping discrepancies before they metastasized. In the days that followed, modifications and checks multiplied. A bolt torque station was fitted with a mechanical counter that recorded every torque event and flagged anomalies. A small group of women, welding specialists, received training to perform micro-inspections of seams with a hand magnifier. Arthur insisted on an acceptance ritual he called the last eye, a solemn pause where the inspector, the welder, and a line operator would sign a chalk mark on the car's dash before it rolled away. The mark was symbolic, an appeal to accountability. It might not show up in any official ledger, but workers treated it like a promise. As the plant ramped up toward that metaphoric and literal cadence, the outside world kept asking for more. More vehicles, faster repairs, routes cleared. The vehicles that left the line were not simply steel and rubber. They were nodes in a larger strategy. They transported medics and scouts, carried radio sets and rations, and, in other contexts, they carried weapons that could amplify destruction. The plant's people were not blind to this duality. The pragmatic answer, quality for protection, was not meant to dismiss the deeper ethical weight, only to situate it within the immediate responsibility to keep soldiers alive. Still, the tension never left them. On a late shift, as the plant prepared for a demonstration intended to convince off-site command that the 2-minute cadence was achievable and sustainable, Arthur paused on the mezzanine and watched his line. He saw small miracles: a brazed joint that showed no hint of fracture, a paint finish without blotch, a wiring harness routed with the care of a tailor stitching. He knew the demonstration was as much performance as proof. The line could be polished. That didn't mean the supply trains would arrive on cue for months on end. Yet the demonstration was also necessary. It would unlock further allocations and justify investments in spare presses and an extra heat treat oven. At midnight, the demonstration began. A camera crew, official with a strict script, mounted a camera on a jib and panned the line. Engineers and supervisors stood in the wings, their faces lit by flood lamps and the same ancient anxiety that accompanies every test. Miguel tightened a final bearing and sent a thumbs up without looking at the camera. Miriam checked the final torque on a lug and exhaled as if she had been holding the air all day. For a breathless hour, the plant rehearsed itself into a near myth. Jeeps rolled off in a cadence that brushed the target. Men and women moved with a choreography that had been practiced and repracticed. The scoreboard ticked. One Jeep. 2 minutes later, another. The metronome sang. Outside, the radios might be reporting trouble in other theaters, but inside the plant, for that hour, there was a fragile triumph. Then, near the end of the demonstration, the seam welder sensor that had been recalibrated hours before tripped. The welder paused, an arc fluttered, and the inspector raised a hand. The line stopped. For a long minute, the plant held its breath.
The demonstration's viewers, some of them military men, leaned forward as if their scrutiny could coax the machine into behaving. An electrician ran to the welder, checked the contacts, and made a small, meticulous adjustment. The trouble was not a grand failure. It was a whisper of misalignment, a reminder that the 2-minute cadence was not a destination already reached, but an altitude to be maintained in turbulence. When the line started again, the next Jeep rolled off with no drama, and the plate of the car, blank in the factory but destined for a unit, glinted under the lamps. Applause was muted, professional. For Arthur, it was not celebration so much as note-taking: where to add redundancy, how to improve the sensor array, which stations needed short rest cycles to prevent fatigue-induced errors. The demonstration had achieved its tactical goal. An authoritative group would recommend more resources to the plant, but it had also revealed the narrow margin between control and chaos. The plant had crossed a threshold in competence. It had not yet mastered the higher-order problem of maintaining that competence under the strain of continuous, unrelenting production. At dawn, with the demonstration behind them and the official men gone, the workers returned to the realities of scale. The plant had to translate a polished hour into a sustained week. More ovens meant more power draw. More presses meant more maintenance staff. The supply chain had to be renovated into a true river, not a trickling creek punctuated by luck. Plans were drawn. The plant drafted a phased rollout, staggered increases in daily output, incremental procurement of dies and ovens, and a cross-training program to ensure that at any point a critical operator could be replaced without collapse. The idea was to create a system resilient enough to absorb shocks, a buffer of parts in a weatherproofed shed, redundancy in welding stations, more rigorous checks on incoming material. But for all the technical and managerial planning, the human questions persisted. Could they ask people to sustain this without wearing them down? Would workers accept the new rotations? How would families cope with longer hours? And what about the deeper moral question that had been surfacing in quiet conversations? What did it mean to perfect a tool meant for war? These questions did not have answers yet, only trade-offs. The plant's next phase would be as much social engineering as mechanical optimization. It would involve not only upgrades to equipment, but also investments in people. Better rest areas, a small medical clinic with a nurse who understood welding fumes and stress, a rotation system that managed fatigue proactively rather than reactively. Arthur argued for these things with the practical urgency of a man who knew that a line that ran faster at the cost of judgment would only produce more dangerous machines.
The ramp-up began in fits and starts. At first, the plant increased output by tightening tolerances on scheduling and adding a few nights to the calendar. Workers traded Saturdays for more consistent weekdays. Some grumbled, some accepted the logic. Then the plant brought in a second shift of seasoned workers from another Finito factory to mentor new recruits. Knowledge transferred in the most concrete way. An old riveter put his hand on a younger man's shoulder and guided the angle of a rivet until the sound of completion entered the student's muscle memory. Yet the effort to scale retained an undercurrent of anxiety. As buffers filled and stock levels rose, management worried about the other theater of the war where materials had been shifted. Bellamy knew the calculus of trade-offs intimately. What you gave in one place, you took from another. He also knew the moral argument would not be settled by engineers. It would be decided in town halls, in letters home, in the quiet minds of those who made choices every hour. And then a new problem lurked at the edge of the plant's operations. A supplier's batch of shock absorbers that had passed initial tests began showing premature wear in long-distance runs. The failures were subtle, an increased rate of oil seepage that was not apparent in bench testing but showed up when vehicles traversed long distances under heavy loads. The phenomenon suggested a mismatch between laboratory conditions and the realities of service in far-flung climates. The plant had built tests to emulate conditions, but the variations in terrain and load in the field were wider than anyone had anticipated. To address the absorber issue, the team proposed a targeted upgrade: a slightly larger oil reservoir in the absorber housing and a change in sealing material to one that resisted heat-induced breakdown. It would require a retooling of a die, a new supplier for the seal, and a short halt to one line. For a plant chasing a 2-minute cadence, halting a line was almost sacrilege. Yet ignoring the problem would create a different kind of cost: vehicles failing in the field, days-long repairs, and likely loss of life. The decision again lay with the humans. Arthur convened a meeting where the trade-off was explained plainly: short-term loss of tempo for long-term reliability. Labor representatives argued for modest compensation for additional testing shifts. Logistics lobbied for faster approval to avoid shipment backlog. Miguel and Miriam, representing the floor, focused on the obvious: fix it now and teach the new assembly sequence to workers before it became routine. They spoke from the vantage point of those who would be expected to maintain the line under the new specification. Consensus tilted toward the fix. The die shop shut for 48 hours to reconfigure, and an outside seal supplier was speeded to priority. The plant stopped its run in a way that felt like a clamp on a living thing. Workers went home tired and hollow, but confident they had chosen the right thing. The temporary dip in production numbers felt like a moral investing, an action that cost now to avoid costlier human consequences later. That evening, as presses cooled and men and women filed out under a sky washed in mercury light, the plant felt simultaneously forward and fragile. For all the ingenuity, for all the incremental wins, the goal of 1 Jeep every 2 minutes hung like a horizon line. Visible, perhaps, but not yet underfoot. Achieving it would require not merely technical fixes, but a social architecture that allowed speed without sacrificing judgment. The next morning held the promise and the test of scaling those fixes across an entire day's production. Men and women who had left early returned to reconfigured stations. The die shop hummed in a different key. New seals were delivered and inspected with almost ritual solemnity. Miguel checked his bearings with a patience that had only deepened with every setback and success. Miriam's bench prepared to sign off on the first cars that would carry the upgraded absorbers. And so the plant moved toward a new phase, one that would prove whether the metronome could become a marathon tempo, whether the human and mechanical systems could operate in a feedback loop that would sustain the target. The demonstration hour had been promising. The small experimental runs had given them confidence. But confidence was only the beginning. The real test was endurance, and endurance required more than machines. It required trust. They did not know it yet, but what lay ahead would demand choices that would reverberate further than the factory gates. It would force them to decide how far they would go to match demand, where they would draw lines on acceptable risk, and how they would carry the moral weight of their success. The plant had learned to listen to metal. Now it would have to learn to listen to people and to the larger world that would receive the products of its labor. The next week began with a narrow, steady intent. Buffers were staged like lifeboats along the line. Racks of stamped parts, pallets of bearings, barrels of grease. A color-coded system kept the right fasteners at the right station. Foremen walked the floor with fresh clipboards, the pages beginning to look like maps. The audible heartbeat, a small imported sub-bass hum of engines and belt drives, found a new consistency. It was still a fragile pulse, but the tempo had grown less tremulous.
Arthur oversaw the rollout with a practical tenderness. He treated the schedule as an instrument to be tuned rather than a set of orders. He had insisted on rolling introductions of new parts and processes, always to the annoyance of procurement, who wanted an all-or-nothing approach. "We will not gamble the field," he told the senior managers. "We will buy certainty in increments and pay for it with time, not with men." The argument won a grudging acceptance, a phased expansion that could be paused at any sign of systemic wobble. Miguel learned to read the new rhythm as if it were a piece of music. He could tell by the spacing between the hiss of the rivet gun and the soft click of a torque wrench whether the station ahead would be ready to accept his assembly. He began to anticipate the conveyor's slight hesitation a full 2 frames before it happened and would put his shoulder to a frame to keep it aligned while a welder tacked. His hands moved with an economy that looked effortless because muscle memory had been hard-earned. At night, he dreamed in torque values and centrifugal harmonics. He woke and rolled his fingers as if they were tuning forks. Miriam, who had always been a guardian of detail, found herself becoming a quiet evangelist for modest ritual. "Sign the dash," she said, re-saying the last eye practice out loud until others adopted it without thinking. The chalk mark became not only a mark of acceptance, but a contract between shifts, the sign of shared accountability. She taught young women to listen for the difference between a bolt turned to spec and a bolt turned to habit. Some of the recruits bristled at first. Then they learned to take pride in small victories, a wiring harness tucked so neatly that no snag would catch it in a convoy, a primer coat so even the sun could not flake it. The plant's managers had pressed for numbers, but Arthur insisted on a different metric, time between significant failures, not raw throughput alone. If the average interval between quality incidents grew, the plant could increase speed. So they scheduled a run that was neither demonstration nor press stunt, but a real test. 8 continuous hours at a cadence that, if kept, would produce 1 Jeep every 2 minutes for a full day. That night, the plant's soundscape shifted. The heartbeat accelerated and took on a machine precision, the kind only possible when human hands and gears reach a rare accord. They achieved the cadence once. They achieved it twice. The scoreboard in the foreman's office ticked to a new color, green. The men and women on the floor allowed themselves a small, almost imperceptible relaxation of the jaw. The rhythm did not mean they had won. It meant they had found a way to keep playing the score. It meant that the plant could feed convoys. It meant that for a time, soldiers might have the vehicles they needed when they needed them. The first sustained 36-hour run came like an orchestra performing without rehearsals. Supervisors staggered brakes so that too many hands would not be off the wheel at once. A small medical tent was set up near the shipping doors. A nurse circled the line like another inspector, checking pallor, offering water, making small triage decisions. Coffee rotated on carts. Hot tins of soup were delivered at regular beats. The plant's heartbeat, the presses, the air compressors, the belt drives kept time with the bodies on the floor. 1 Jeep. 2 minutes later, another. The rhythm became a mechanical hymn. Yet no triumph is without a cost. Muscles tightened in new places. The electrician who calibrated sensors on the second night found a tachometer that drifted slowly. The recalibration took longer than expected, and 10 finished vehicles sat in a temporary holding area while inspectors rechecked the seams and harnesses. Each minute counted. Each minute also saved lives. Miguel thought of that image pinned to his chest, the photograph of his brother, and worked with a steadier hand. There were incidents that the plant would not forget. A night loader collapsed from heat exhaustion in a dark corner by the receiving dock. Someone found him in time, his face waxen. A welder's glove snagged on a workbench and burned their palm, a badge of sacrifice that would leave a scar and a cautionary rule added to the safety roster. None of these events were grand in scale, but together they composed a ledger of human cost. The leadership began to treat mitigation of that cost as part of the engineering task, adding rest benches, improving airflow, rotating strenuous tasks. The plant's managers learned that a line that cared for bodies could run longer without error. Fatigue was a hidden failure mode, as insidious as a cracked die. Boards of timber were built into the shop floor where workers could sit for a measly 10 minutes and feel the pulse of the factory settle around them.
Hymns were not sung here. No patriotic fervor rang through the halls. Instead, people exchanged dried fruit and hand-rolled cigarettes, and stories of small things that made the day bearable. A neighbor who watched a child, a letter that arrived, the smell of rain on the roof. These micro-societies were a bulwark against the erosion of judgment. When the plant finally announced a full-scale production sprint, some of the technicians who had been skeptical joined the cheering in their own wary way. They did not celebrate like men who had won a war. They celebrated like men who had discovered a way to do something hard without killing too many of the people around them. The sprint was not a stunt. It was a carefully staged ascent to sustained output. Rotating crews, extra ovens, spare dies on standby, redundant sensors, and a medical team that slept in the locker room.
The plant's leadership had negotiated with regional logistics to ensure that rail cars would be prioritized for the crates and pallets bound for the shipping yard. A fragile river of supply began, and the plant's decks received it like a ferry. For days, the line sang the same song: press, stamp, weld, paint, inspect, roll off. The scoreboard outside the foreman's office recorded a relentless number. The cumulative cars per hour climbed, and for many shifts, the average time between roll-offs hovered around the 2-minute mark. The men and women who owned the stations took comfort in this metronome. Their bodies learned the cadence like a breathing pattern. Miguel began to time his cigarette breaks to it. Miriam matched her laughter to the rhythm. They were at once less and more than factory workers. They were the keepers of a pulse that reached into faraway mud and flame. But the plant's success rippled outward and created new questions. Freight that had once carried coal now bore axles and gasoline cans. Priorities elsewhere shifted to feed the river that would keep this plant running. Other plants muttered about a supplier's shift of priorities. Union representatives in other states asked why their own shops had not received equal attention. The wartime economy was, by definition, a house of priorities. For this plant to keep the heartbeat at 2 minutes required a rebalancing that increased strain in other corners. Miriam raised the issue quietly during a union talk. If the rhythm here saved some lives, what did it cost in others? The question hung like a cloud and never entirely abated. Beyond these trade-offs, there were technical legacies revealed as the tempo held. The procedures they had developed, buffer storage, color-coded pallet systems, jig redesigns, localized heat treatment sequencing, proved portable. Engineers from other factories came to observe. Journal articles, engineers' papers, not anything heroic, cataloged methods that lowered failure rates in stamped parts and improved quench temper cycles for small-diameter springs. These were not miracles, they were mundane improvements that, aggregated, raised the industrial floor. The plant's work became a seedbed for post-war manufacturing practice, an emphasis on process control, preventative maintenance, and the human-centered factory. Shipments began to leave in steady convoys. Trucks lined the approach, a dark, humming snake wrapped in canvas. Men used to talk of trains and ships in the abstract. Now they watched pallets loaded onto flat cars and imagined the miles ahead. Miguel watched a convoy leave one afternoon and thought of the soldier who might be in one of those vehicles. He pressed his palm to the steel and felt its residual warmth. He whispered a wish and folded his hands into the palms of work calluses. The convoy images were cinematic in their simplicity. Flat cars clanking under stars, roll-on ramps slamming with the soft thud of iron on wood. Sailors watching the loading read their own urgent set of tasks. From the plant's perspective, a jeep's journey ended at the port. In reality, the vehicle's life was just beginning. A jeep might see wide desert, muddy roads, mountain trails, or narrow European lanes crowded with civilians. It might carry a medic, a messenger, a scout. It might carry a weapon. The men and women of the plant did not stop to parse the differences in every case. They prepared the product to the standard that minimized the risk of failure. On the front lines, letters began to arrive from the field, some typeset by command, some raw and handwritten. A lieutenant wrote of a convoy that reached a cut-off unit because the vehicles had not failed on the bridge. A medic wrote to thank the plant for a sturdy radio mount that had kept a field telephone working. A terse, bureaucratic cable mentioned replaced parts and repeated thanks. Arthur kept these notes in his drawer. He read them at odd hours and sometimes pressed his thumb to the paper to imagine the faces behind the ink. They were proof that machinery could do good and that craft could save, but they were not absolution for the ambiguity of purpose. That ambiguity deepened as footage surfaced, grainy and official, showing jeeps moving behind armored columns in operations that inflicted civilian harm. The plant's people watched with a hollow feeling. No one asked for the images to be screened in the shop. The sight of smoke and ruined houses belonged to a sphere beyond rivets and torque values. Still, the images found a way to the break room, to quiet conversation over coffee at midnight. Miriam's face would harden, and she would speak a sentence that could be read as both resignation and resolve. Do it well, so perhaps fewer have to die. The line lived under that sentence, quality as a moral lever. War moves in paradoxes. A vehicle that saves a platoon may also be used to attack a village. The people who made the jeeps felt these dual uses acutely. In small rituals, messages pinned to a corkboard, a moment's silence before a shared lunch, they attempted to hold the complexity without dissolving into cynicism. They would repair bias and learn to look inward without letting inwardness freeze their hands. As the war wound down in some theaters and shifted in others, the plant faced another transformation, the transition from wartime sprint to peacetime reorientation. Conversation shifted from how many could be produced to what could be made with the same machinery afterward. The plant's leadership, mindful of the post-war economy, began to think in terms of machines that could be repurposed. Stampings that could produce plumbing fittings, welding jigs adaptable to civilian trucks, ovens that could temper bearings for farming equipment. The human capital, the learned habits of workmanship, was as valuable as any press. For many workers, the end of intense production promised relief and dread in equal measure. The same skills that had made them indispensable in war might be redundant in peace. Some feared layoffs. Others hoped to convert their wartime pay into businesses that would build a life after the ration cards and blackout curtains. Miguel thought of the photograph in his jacket and of the small town back home where his mother kept a garden. He wanted to be there, not to forget the line that had become a second nature, but to be part of the rebuilding that would follow. When the plant's orders decreased, the production lines creaked, then slowed. The heartbeat that once drove shifts into the night softened like a tide going out. The buffers of parts dwindled. The smell of hot oil retreated from its dominance. There were goodbyes in the locker rooms, small tokens exchanged. A bottle of whiskey, a carved wooden box, a watch. Arthur watched the line slow and felt a precise kind of grief. That of someone who had stewarded an organism and knew how abruptly the organism could change. The post-war years revealed an unexpected afterlife for the Jeep and for the skills that produced it. Surplus vehicles were sold to civilians in many places. Farmers adapted Jeeps into tractors. Towns used them for community transport, and islanders prized them for their simple ruggedness on paths where cars could not tread. In marketplaces and in remote roads, Jeeps took on new identities. A flatbed mule hauling feed, a fisherman's vehicle with a salt-weathered canvas, a small bus for children. The very adaptability that had made the Jeep militarily useful made it valuable in rebuilding economies. Technological legacies persisted in subtler forms. The plant's emphasis on process control found its way into civilian manufacturing. Quality assurance practices matured. Checklists replaced gut calls in many shops. Metallurgists who had learned to read steel under microscopes went on to develop alloys for peacetime industry, contributing to engines and structures that lifted planes and built bridges. The idea that a factory could be humane,
provide medical care, reasonable rotations, and a voice for workers, gained traction because it had worked where it mattered most. Those were not tidy victories, but they were real. Museums eventually claimed a few surviving vehicles as artifacts. A Jeep that had once rolled off the line in a green-painted bay of the plant found quiet refuge under a soft light glass in a hall of 20th century industry. Visitors suckled it, reading placards that carefully balanced technical description and ethical context. An old welder, his hands now handle-worn and slight, came one afternoon and placed a small scrap of metal on the Jeep's dashboard, a token of his long career.
He ran a thumb along a rivet and remembered the tremble of a line and the face of a friend who had not come back from a far road. The museum guard watched him respectfully. People crossed the rope and, for a small price, were allowed to touch the rubber of a tire, soft with age, and to imagine the hands that had fitted it. Years later, Arthur would sit in a little office that smelled faintly of old paper. His hair had silvered. He kept, as he always had, a box of letters, some typewritten, some stained with coffee, tucked in a drawer. He had never stopped believing in careful workmanship, and he had never stopped being troubled by the dualities of wartime products. He started, late in life, to lecture in a local technical school. He taught process control and the ethics of engineering with equal seriousness, insisting that the two were inseparable. You cannot do one well without the other, he would tell students, and he meant it literally and morally. Miguel, older now, had returned to his town and started a small repair shop. He took in old engines, learned to fix radios, and taught a handful of apprentices the same ear for bearing that had once saved batches on the line. They called him when a stubborn axle creaked or when a farmer's machine refused to start. He told stories about the plant in measured doses, never boasting, always careful to include the cost that had come with the speed. Miriam remained in the city and took a job coordinating quality control across a cluster of factories. She kept the chalk mark ritual alive in a loose way, encouraging artisans and assembly workers to sign off their work and carry that small pride with them. Time softened many edges, but left others raw. Veterans would come to the museum and sit by the Jeep, fingers finding the once familiar contours. Some died before they could tell all the stories. Some wrote small notes that were folded and left under the dashboard. These notes were simple: a name, a date, a memory of a field radio that held, and a friend who did not. Arthur read some in his later years and cried once or twice in the privacy of his study. Miguel sometimes opened a small cabinet where he kept a folded letter his brother had written, old ink softened by years. Miriam kept a small blade in her purse, more sentimental than practical, a reminder of the bench where she had learned to smooth paint flecks. The factory itself changed. Indefino, unknown to those now younger, took over some operations elsewhere. Presses were sold, ovens repurposed. The great hall that had once pulsed with the heartbeat of production sat quieter and, in some places, repainted for other uses. Some buildings were demolished, boxes of blueprints shredded or tucked in archivists' files. Other plants were converted to civilian manufacturing, their staff retrained. The mechanical heartbeat remained, like an echo, sometimes present in new factories, sometimes only a memory told over coffee. In the years that followed, historians and engineers debated the place of production in strategic outcomes. Some argued that material advantage was decisive. Others apportioned more weight to strategy and leadership. The people on the shop floor rarely argued in abstractions. They measured success in bolts well torqued and in the way a bearing spun without whispering. They measured failure in the flip side: parts that broke, breath that faltered, letters from the field stained with loss. The truth, as the workers felt it, sat in the middle. Machines mattered, but they were nothing without the judgment of those who made them, and processes mattered most when they protected the people who would use the products.
There is an odd intimacy to objects that carry people through danger. A Jeep is both tool and witness. It bears mud, bullet marks, and the flaking paint that tells of nights by fires. It becomes stitched into a person's memory as much as into metal. When museums preserve such objects, they do more than display steel. They hold an archive of choices and compromises, of nights spent too long under lamps, and of decisions made in the narrow hours before dawn. Visitors stand and try to imagine the hands that had tightened a bolt at an impossible tempo. They read the placards and sometimes weep. In time, a small veterans reunion was organized in the town near the plant. Men and women who had once worked the lines and those who had used the vehicles met under a pale sky to stand beside a preserved Jeep. Tears were exchanged without shame. Laughter came in briefer bursts. Conversations meandered between technicalities and memory. Someone produced a small radio and tuned it to music that had played in the canteens decades before. The tune was a thread that pulled the room together. Miguel, with hands that had known both torque and tenderness, lifted a cup and toasted the invisible village of people who had made possible a cadence of 2 minutes. At the end of the reunion, a former driver, older and stooped, walked to the Jeep and placed a small, worn piece of cloth on the seat. He brushed his fingertips along the steering wheel, then stood back and said, to nobody in particular, "She kept me whole when she could." The statement carried the weight of many stories, of rescue and fear, of duty and chance. No one tried to simplify it. The factory story, like most industrial tales, is not a tidy arc of virtue and victory. It is a braid of labor and invention, of economy and ethics. The plant that, at its height, managed to release a Jeep every 2 minutes did so through cooperation, technique, and innumerable small acts of care. It did not win or lose alone. It was part of a complex human machine. Its legacy is both the tangible, machines that continue to serve in new roles, and the intangible, lessons in process, in worker care, in the moral responsibilities of production.
Years after the final shifts and the last convoys, a single preserved vehicle remained in a small, respectful display at the museum. Floodlight washed its rounded hood. A plaque, carefully worded, said only enough, that the vehicle was an example of wartime mass production and that the people who made it had labored under complex demands. School children were guided past it. Hands pointed to rivets and to the small chalk mark, explained as a symbol of accountability. Teachers spoke of innovation and sacrifice in the same breath, neither eliding one for the other. At the edge of the display, an old woman who had once welded seams with a practiced arc listened to the hush and remembered the metronome, the presses marking time, hammers beating, the tiny mechanical heartbeat that had once synchronized 1,000 human motions. She reached out and laid her palm against the glass, feeling no warmth, only the memory of heat. She closed her eyes and let a breath go slow and full. It is easy, in stories of machines and factories, to let the cadence become the character. Yet the lasting image is often quieter. The face of a worker who adjusted a fixture at midnight, the nurse who caught a hand before it burned, the apprentice who learned the right angle to catch a rivet. They are the ones who turned metal into lifelines, and sometimes those lifelines saved lives, and sometimes they made complex outcomes more likely. The product, the Jeep, remains ambivalent. It can be a shelter, a carriage, a rescue vehicle, a weapon. It can be repurposed for plowing a field or for crossing a desert. The people who built it made choices in a context that demanded speed and demanded conscience. On the museum's final evening, as lamps dimmed and the caretakers locked the gates, the old welder lingered by the preserved vehicle. He had not come to mourn or to celebrate, just to keep company with an object that had once lived with him. He pressed a small coin into a seam of the Jeep, a private ritual,
and walked away, the echo of his footsteps measured against a long, quiet drum of industry. Outside, the sound of the city moved on. Inside, the hall's mechanical heartbeat, once so insistent, had finally quieted. But when the lights went out and the museum doors shut, there was a sense that the pulse had not vanished so much as moved into a different register. Memory, lesson, caution, pride. In certain late hours, if you stood near the display and listened, you could almost imagine the soft machinery of human recollection, forming its own cadence, less regular than the factory's metronome, but steady in its own way. If you have been with this story, you have followed the path from the first hesitant crack of a stamping die to the long, steady rhythm where one Jeep rolled off the line every 2 minutes.
You have seen how people and machines learn to work together, how failures taught them, how ethics threaded through decisions, how post-war life rewove the tools of conflict into instruments of civilian need. The plant's achievement is both technical and human. It is a story of persistence, of careful correction, of the small acts that accumulate into a capacity to do something extraordinary. If this story moved you, subscribe to find more deep behind-the-scenes histories of factories, inventions, and the people who made them. There are always more rhythms to hear and more lessons under the hum of machines. In the end, the rhythm that had once marked the plant was not a simple triumph or a simple condemnation. It was a human-made tempo, a heartbeat balanced on cogs and conscience. The Jeep that rolled off the line every 2 minutes carried with it the fingerprints of those who made it, their skill, their weariness, their intention, and it entered a world where tools are used in ways both noble and tragic. Remembering that is not a burden to bear alone, but a responsibility to keep. A quiet metronome for the choices to come.